Almost every serious historian agrees on this. Atlantis was fiction, a philosophical allegory invented by Plato to make a political point. A story so compelling that 24 centuries of readers have convinced themselves it must be true. How could a story this detailed be fiction? How could a story this specific be allegory? Those are the questions that won't go away. And here's the one that keeps me up at night. What if the historians are right that Plato embellished the story, but wrong that the story has no origin? What if somewhere beneath the literary flourishes there is a seed, a memory of something that actually happened, a civilization that existed, that was destroyed, and that humanity almost completely forgot? The story. It begins not with Plato. It begins with a man named Solon. Solon was one of the most respected statesmen of ancient Athens. Around 590 BCE, he traveled to Egypt and visited the city of Sais. One of the elder priests there said something remarkable. He told Solon that the Greeks were children, not as an insult, literally. He said the Greeks had no old knowledge, no science seasoned by time, no memory of long ages. That great catastrophes, floods, fires had periodically destroyed civilization, resetting it to zero, and that Egypt alone had preserved the records of what came before. In those records, the priest said, was the account of a civilization that had existed 9,000 years before Solon's own time. A maritime empire of extraordinary reach that had threatened to subjugate both Egypt and Greece. And then, in a single day and a single night, it was gone. Consumed by earthquakes and floods, the island beyond the Pillars of Hercules, beyond the Strait of Gibraltar, sunk beneath the Atlantic. Solon carried this story home. It passed through his family for generations. Eventually, it reached Plato, who wrote it down around 360 BCE. He named the lost civilization Atlantis. Now here's what most people miss about this account. The Egyptian priests didn't frame the story as myth. They framed it as history. Their history, preserved in their records for 9,000 years before Solon arrived. They told him Egypt alone had kept the memory. Whether you believe them or not, whether Atlantis is history or allegory, Plato was recording something specific, an Egyptian priestly tradition, ancient enough that its keepers considered themselves the inheritors of something lost. They believed it. And the date they gave, 9,000 years before Solon, places the catastrophe at approximately 9,600 BCE. That date should be impossible, and for most of the 20th century, it was. Until 1994, the date that broke the model, 9,600 BCE. For decades, that date was the easiest part of the Atlantis story to dismiss. Any archaeologist in 1970 could tell you. There was nothing at that date. No civilization. No complex society. No organized architecture. Just hunter-gatherers following animal herds. A maritime empire threatening Greece and Egypt in 9,600 BCE is, by every conventional measure, impossible. And so Atlantis was filed away as philosophy. End of story. Then in 1994, a Kurdish shepherd in southeastern Turkey kicked something with his boot. Carved stone. A German archaeologist named Klaus Schmidt came to look. He spent the next 22 years of his life excavating what he found. Göbekli Tepe, a complex of massive stone enclosures, T-shaped limestone pillars up to 5.5 meters tall, weighing up to 15 tons, carved with sophisticated animal reliefs, foxes, vultures, serpents, scorpions. The carvings are not crude. They are confident, skilled, the work of people with a clear artistic tradition. The date of the oldest layers? Approximately 9,600 BCE. The same date as the destruction of Atlantis. Now, Göbekli Tepe is in Turkey. Atlantis supposedly sank in the Atlantic. The geographical connection is zero. But the chronological coincidence refuses to go away. Because here's what this means. If people were capable of building something like Göbekli Tepe in 9,600 BCE, organized, sophisticated monumental construction at that date, then the entire premise that allowed historians to dismiss Atlantis collapses. The premise was, civilization didn't exist then. Göbekli Tepe says something did. Something sophisticated enough to quarry 15-ton stones, transport them, erect them with precision, and carve them with genuine artistic skill. And something strange happened to that tradition. The oldest enclosures at Göbekli Tepe, the deepest, most ancient layers, contain the largest, most sophisticated pillars. The later layers are simpler, smaller, less refined. The tradition runs backward. That is not what an emerging civilization looks like. When you're learning something new, the early work is rough and gets better with practice. At Göbekli Tepe, the oldest work is the best work, which means the builders didn't invent this tradition. They inherited it from somewhere. And then, around 8,000 BCE, someone deliberately buried the entire complex, not abandoned, buried, systematically filled the enclosures with rubble, soil, worked stone, covered the pillars, sealed everything underground, and walked away. The site sat hidden for 9,000 years until a shepherd's boot disturbed it in 1994. Why would you bury your greatest achievement? What were you hiding it from? Or, were you hiding it for someone? That question doesn't have an answer, but it has a context, and the context is a catastrophe. The catastrophe. Around 12,800 years ago, the world was warming. The last ice age was ending, glaciers retreating, seas rising. Things were getting better. And then, without warning, it reversed. Within decades, possibly within years, temperatures in the North Atlantic dropped by as much as 10 degrees Celsius. Glaciers re-advanced, forests died. The world was thrown back into near glacial conditions for roughly 1,200 years. This is called the Younger Dryas. It is not a hypothesis. It is one of the most robustly documented climate events in the geological record, confirmed in Greenland ice cores, ocean sediments, lake deposits on multiple continents. What caused it is contested. But the leading alternative hypothesis is considerably more dramatic than anything the conventional explanation offers. The Younger Dryas impact. Hypothesis proposes that roughly 12,800 years ago, a comet or swarm of cometary fragments broke apart over the northern hemisphere and exploded in a series of airbursts across North America, Europe, and parts of Asia simultaneously. Fire from the sky, massive wildfires, ice sheets destabilized, catastrophic floods into the North Atlantic, disrupting ocean circulation and triggering the climate collapse. The physical evidence, a specific layer in the geological record at the exact moment the Younger Dryas began, containing nanodiamonds that form only under cosmic impact conditions, platinum anomalies consistent with extraterrestrial material, magnetic spherules, and melt glass formed at temperatures no wildfire can produce, found at over 50 sites across 4 continents. The debate is real and ongoing. Critics have challenged specific markers, but the evidence keeps accumulating. And here is what this means for Atlantis. If any sophisticated coastal civilization existed 12,800 years ago, and the best human populations throughout prehistory preferred coastlines for their resources, then the sequence of events would have been fire first, then catastrophic climate collapse for 1,200 years, then, as destabilized ice sheets discharged into the ocean, catastrophic sea level rise. The coastlines of the Ice Age world are now under 120 meters of water. The harbors, the trading ports, the centers of accumulated knowledge, drowned. And Göbekli Tepe, built at the end of the Younger Dryas by people whose oldest work is their most sophisticated, was built 100 years after the Younger Dryas ended. 100 years after the catastrophe lifted. By people who seemed to have been preserving something they knew was slipping away, encoding it in stone, burying it, hiding it for whoever came next. The timing between the Younger Dryas, the date Atlantis was destroyed, and the construction of Göbekli Tepe is not a coincidence anyone has satisfactorily explained away. Plato's details. Now here is what makes the Atlantis account harder to dismiss than pure allegory. The specific details. Plato describes the capital city of Atlantis with extraordinary precision. Concentric rings of land and water, separated by canals of specific dimensions. A royal palace of specific materials, agricultural zones, a military harbor, trade routes. These are not the details of a philosophical allegory. These are the details of someone describing a real place, or transmitting a description of a real place that had been passed down. The priests at Sais told Solon they had preserved the records. 9,000 years of records. The archives of Sais are gone, buried under the Nile Delta, inaccessible, effectively lost. We cannot verify what they contained, but we can ask, if the Egyptian priests believed they were the inheritors of something lost, what would have given them that belief? What were they preserving? There is a second detail in Plato's account that almost never gets discussed. He says Atlantis was destroyed in a single day and a single night, not gradually, not over generations as sea levels rose. A single day. What kind of catastrophe destroys a civilization in a single day and night? A comet, an airburst, fire from the sky, the Younger Dryas impact. Hypothesis describes exactly that, not the slow drowning of a coastline, a sudden, violent, catastrophic event, followed by the floods. The timing Plato gives, the description of how it ended, is consistent with what the geological evidence suggests actually happened at approximately that date. That consistency is not proof, but it is something. The drowned world. Here's what we know for certain. During the last ice age, sea levels were approximately 120 to 130 meters lower than today. Vast areas of what are now shallow ocean floors were dry land. The North Sea between England and Denmark, now open water, was a plain of forests and rivers called Doggerland, inhabited by large human populations. We know this because North Sea fishing trawlers have been pulling up their tools and mammoth bones for generations. A carved red deer antler point dated to 12,000 years ago. Stone tools, mammoth remains, peat from ancient forests. By 6,500 BCE, Doggerland was gone, submerged. Archaeologists have reconstructed its coastlines and called it, with understatement, one of the most densely populated regions of prehistoric Europe. All of it is now 30 to 40 meters underwater. The Sundaland Shelf in Southeast Asia, connecting what are now the islands of Indonesia to mainland Asia, was a landmass the size of India. Submerged. The Persian Gulf Basin, now a sea, was a river valley. The Tigris and Euphrates ran through it, down to an ocean coast, hundreds of kilometers further south. Submerged. If a sophisticated civilization existed in the late Ice Age world, its most likely heartland was on the coastlines that are now underwater. We have barely looked. We have better maps of the surface of Mars than of our own ocean floor. And in the few places where people have looked underwater, really looked, with cameras and sonar, the results have been ambiguous enough to keep the question open. Off the coast of Japan, near the island of Yonaguni, divers in 1987 found a broad platform of rock with what appeared to be steps, right angles, and terraced formations cut into its face. Two different geologists looked at it and reached opposite conclusions. One called it man-made. One called it natural fracturing along geological fault lines. The debate has never been settled. What is not disputed? If it was modified by humans, it was above water during the Ice Age, between 8,000 and 12,000 years ago. Off the coast of India, in the Gulf of Kambat, sonar surveys in 2001 detected what appeared to be the outlines of submerged structures at a depth consistent with submersion 9,000 to 10,000 years ago. Artifacts recovered included pottery and worked stone. Independent verification has been limited. The site has not been excavated. Off the Bahamas, a formation of large flat limestone blocks arranged in a curved pattern half a kilometer long sits in 6 meters of water, called the Bimini Road. Mainstream geologists say it's natural beach rock fractured by wave action. Others argue the regularity of the blocks is inconsistent with natural formation. Genuinely unresolved. None of these sites is Atlantis, but all of them are question marks on the ocean floor that have never been definitively answered. And the systematic underwater survey of the most relevant continental shelves, the areas most likely to contain evidence of Ice Age coastal civilization, has never been conducted. Not because of conspiracy, because underwater archaeology is extraordinarily expensive, technically demanding, and career risky for the researchers who pursue it. The evidence, if it exists, is in the one place we have barely looked. The strongest objections. Let's be honest about the problems, because they are real. Where is the writing? A civilization sophisticated enough to threaten Egypt, and Greece would have needed record-keeping of some kind. Every known complex civilization developed writing or proto-writing. We have found no pre-Younger Dryas writing system anywhere, not in caves, not on hilltops, not on the ocean floor surveys that have been conducted. The lost civilization response, it's all underwater. Every scrap of writing from coastal civilizations was drowned when sea levels rose. That's possible, but it requires every single record, every inland cache, every hilltop inscription to have been either underwater or destroyed. Not one surviving. Where are the tools? Complex construction requires manufacturing infrastructure, quarries, workshops, metalworking sites. These are not all coastal. They follow ore deposits and stone sources, which are often inland. We find the tools of every known ancient civilization. Not one pre-Younger Dryas manufacturing site has ever been identified anywhere on land. Where is the biological trace? A civilization of millions would have transformed its environment. Deforestation. Domesticated species spreading through ecosystems. Pollen signatures of agriculture. The pre-Younger Dryas biological record is consistent with a sparsely populated world of hunter-gatherers, not consistent with a large agricultural civilization. And then there is the simplest objection of all. Plato was a philosopher who invented illustrative fictions for philosophical purposes. The Ring of Gyges, the myth of air, the cave allegory, all invented. The Republic is not a literal blueprint for a real city. Atlantis appears in a dialogue about the corrupting effect of power and imperial overreach. It is pedagogically perfect. Maybe too perfect. The simplest explanation for Atlantis remains. Plato made it up. These objections are serious. They have not been satisfactorily answered by anyone arguing for a real Atlantis. But here is the asymmetry at the heart of the debate. These objections are all arguments from silence. We haven't found evidence. We haven't looked everywhere. The continental shelves exposed during the last ice age, covering enormous areas, have not been systematically surveyed. The absence of evidence in this case genuinely does not mean what it usually means, because the evidence, if it exists, is in places we have barely begun to examine. What would prove it? This is the question that separates serious investigation from speculation. What would it actually take? The underwater technology now exists to begin systematic survey of the most relevant continental shelves. Autonomous underwater vehicles can map the seafloor at resolutions approaching aerial photography. They can identify topographic anomalies, regular shapes, linear features that don't fit the surrounding geology. They cannot yet see a wall or a carved stone directly from satellite data, but they can identify where to send divers. This work has barely started. If a pre-Younger Dryas civilization left physical traces, the most likely places are the Sundaland Shelf, the Persian Gulf Basin, the North Sea Shelf, the Atlantic coastal shelves of North Africa and Iberia. A single definitively dated structure, a carved stone, a foundation, anything human-made, from below the Younger Dryas boundary in water that was dry land 12,000 years ago, would rewrite history. Not find Atlantis as Plato described it, but prove that sophisticated human societies existed at that date and in those coastal regions. Which is the actual question behind the Atlantis myth, not golden palaces, not concentric canals. Were there sophisticated people in the places that were destroyed? That question has not been answered. Because we haven't looked in the places where the answer would be. Conclusion. Maybe Atlantis was never real. Maybe Plato sat in Athens and invented a cautionary tale about hubris and power, the kind of philosophical fiction he constructed throughout his career. And 2,500 years of obsessive searching has been a magnificent wild goose chase led by an allegory. Maybe. Or maybe the Egyptian priests were telling the truth. Maybe somewhere in the archives of Sais, buried now under the Nile Delta, inaccessible, there were records of something that actually happened. A civilization that was there. Sophisticated enough to be remembered across 9,000 years of transmission. Catastrophic enough to be almost forgotten. Real enough that the memory of it, distorted, compressed, mythologized, survived intact enough for Plato to write it down. The date Plato gives corresponds to the end of the Younger Dryas, to the construction of Göbekli Tepe, to the period when coastal civilizations worldwide would have been destroyed by the combination of cosmic impact, climate collapse, and catastrophic sea level rise. That convergence of dates is either the most significant coincidence in the history of archaeology, or it's pointing at something real. We don't know, and we won't know until we look in the right places. The ocean floor is out there, patient, still, waiting for the moment when we decide this matters enough to look.